All right, so I'm gonna give some history of Scotland, and not sure, not sure how impressive it'll be, just for the reason that my knowledge of history is like I'm not necessarily going to know all the exact details. I know a lot of the broad contour, and especially the kind of a lot of the little known bits and a lot of the kind of suppressed history, but I don't know all the names and dates of everything. Just generally the chronology. So Scotland, full disclosure, I'm paternally Scottish. My parents are both paternally Scottish, and that was a part of what led me to study Scotland. But I mean, the main reason I got into studying Scotland was just that I discovered that the real history was different and more complex than I had been told, or most people seem to know. So there's like a niche there for historians to expand and to clarify the record, basically. So Scotland is, in case anybody doesn't know, it's the northern third, maybe, of the island of Britain. There's England is basically the southern 2/3 or most of that, and then there's Wales is a smaller portion, sort of in the west and in the middle, and so Scotland is a very northerly country. It was, one of the more northern countries in the world, and in some ways it was basically like the ends of the earth for its location. I think the Romans sometimes talked about it that way, that this, like, Scotland was like the ends of the earth when the Romans took over England and had to deal with the Scots raiding their colony constantly. But I'll try to give some overview of the origins of Scotland. I think during, like in Paleolithic times, I think Britain was inhabited by Neanderthals, and may have been inhabited earlier by earlier hominins, either Heidelberg or Erectus or somebody, I'm not sure. But at least Neanderthal was at least in England. But we don't know whether or not, I don't think there's evidence of whether Neanderthal was in Scotland or not. Scotland may have been covered with, glaciation, glaciers, may have been uninhabitable, I'm not sure. But there were at least people in Scotland by like the Mesolithic, I think, by maybe like 14,000 years ago. I'm not sure exactly when, but there's evidence of people, I think, in Argyllshire, some sort of Paleolithic or Mesolithic culture there. And so then more people came with the Neolithic, and they settled. I think the Neolithic farmers came from the Middle East, agriculture, civilization, in the kind of normal sense of the word, began in the Middle East, spread. Middle Easterners came to other parts of the world and spread it. I think a lot of the European Neolithic was spearheaded by Aegean people who had been spread to in turn by the earlier Neolithic people from basically Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia. Northern Mesopotamia is where civilization began, seemingly where agriculture began, around Göbekli Tepe and surrounding regions, about 12,000 years ago. And so it spread west, and I'm not sure. So it might have been through the Aegeans that were influenced by the Anatolians, who were influenced by the northern Mesopotamians, who ended up colonizing Scotland first. I'm not 100% sure, but basically the Neolithic people came to Orkney, which is either an island or maybe a few islands, or multiple islands off the northern coast of Scotland. So, and this was at a time when Britain was not necessarily an island. I think, Britain was not an island. It was a peninsula of Europe. And, well, I would say it was a peninsula of Asia, because Europe couldn't really be said to exist yet, since the Black Sea was still quite basically a smaller freshwater lake, and I think the Aegean itself was probably much smaller. And the Bosporus Strait was probably much smaller, if it even existed. I'm not exactly sure. So these Neolithic farmers came to Scotland, and they brought the megalithic stonemasonry technology from that had seemingly started at Göbekli Tepe and in that area at least 12,000 years ago. Basically, like Stonehenge, what we see as Stonehenge. Stonehenge is a kind of more dilapidated version, you could say, of the early temples at Göbekli Tepe that are 12,000 years old. Like Enclosure D at Göbekli Tepe, which is very megalithic. And so this type of megalithic stonemasonry, where you have these pillars that are kind of flat, oblong pillars, they're like skinny on one side and wide on the other side, like the pillars that make up Stonehenge. That was how Göbekli Tepe was built 12,000 years ago through 10,000 years ago. That was a site that was, they continued building temples from at least 12,000 years ago until 10,000 years ago, although they probably the earliest temples there, the earliest megalithic temples are probably about 20,000 years old or earlier, but they've yet to be excavated. The older ones have been, built on top of successively. So all we know is that there are a lot more and probably much older temples still buried there. So these people that were probably partly descended directly from the Göbekli Tepe Neolithic revolutionaries, the sort of technological elites of the Neolithic, was probably somewhat descended from them, but then also descended from Anatolian and Aegean people. They settled in Orkney about and I'm thinking it's between 6,000 and 8,000 years ago. So, yeah, this is something where I would be better if I was writing it because I could Google each little date and clarify, but long time ago, I would say probably 7 or 8,000 years ago. I'm not sure, but somewhere around there, you start seeing this megalithic masonry in Orkney, and just all over Orkney. There's like the Ring of Brodgar, I think, is there, and someplace Clanach. I don't know if that's Orkney, but from Orkney it spread through the rest of Scotland and ultimately to England, and then, resulting in Stonehenge, among other monumental sites. So basically, the people who built Stonehenge, those Neolithic, megalithic farmers, were Scottish, you could say. They came to England from Scotland, and they probably came to Scotland from the Aegean, and to the Aegean from Anatolia, and to Anatolia from northern Mesopotamia, and there was probably a bunch of steps in between there. I don't know if they were part of the Malta culture or any other kind of Mediterranean or European cultures on the way over. I'm sure they were. But yeah, so Scotland was kind of the first seat of the Neolithic in the British Isles, and then it spread to England, and with agriculture, these people brought agriculture from Scotland to England, and they brought the masonry, and they built Stonehenge, and so I think those were called the Long Barrow people, because they built tombs, I suppose, that were long barrows, long kind of tunnel tombs, and then they were, I believe, basically largely wiped out and replaced. Not completely, but mostly wiped out and replaced. Eventually, I'm not sure when, maybe like 4,000 years ago or so, by I guess the Beaker people. There's maybe I'm not sure if the Long Barrow people are the same as the Corded Ware people, or if the Corded Ware people are the Beaker people. I think the Beaker people were the later ones that came in, and and I guess I'm not sure if the Beaker people were Neolithic as well, or if they were the Bronze Age. I'm guessing they were Neolithic, but yeah, I know that the Long Barrow people tended to resemble more the classic Neolithic race, in the sense of having very long crania, long Neanderthaloid heads, and often artificially Neanderthalized, because basically these were Neanderthaloid hybrids, just as pretty much everybody in Eurasia was at that time. And And like nowadays, everybody's basically a Neanderthaloid hybrid, but mostly not very much. Like, whereas in those days, people had like a lot more of the Neanderthal DNA. So they had much longer heads, larger brains compared to sapiens, and they had much longer noses, projecting nasal bridges, which projected at a much kind of higher angle forward. They had very large eyes, large ears, large brow ridges, and these are the characteristics of what have often been called the Neolithic race. And that is to say, the people who invented civilization, or at least the people who gave it to us. It could be that civilization is at that level is much older, and seemingly it was much older than is known, but it was basically developed and disseminated by those heavily Neanderthaloid hybrids, whereas the later people that came to Britain were less Neanderthaloid. I think they were taller. The Neolithic race also tended to be relatively short on average, although some of, especially the elites, were quite tall, but the average person was short. And the Neolithic race overlaps a lot with kind of what would be called the Mediterranean race, or maybe Middle Eastern. And also it's called sometimes the Iberian race. And I know the word race is like taboo nowadays, but it's literally just a word, so I'm sure you can handle it. So these folks, the newcomers, were taller. They had rounder heads. These were the Beaker people. And don't know, I guess, as much of about them, unless they may have been the early Bronze Age, and they may have been the kind of proto-Celts. Maybe they were kind of the ones who first really settled Ireland. But I'm not sure, because Ireland also was very megalithic. So either the Long Barrow people, I mean, Ireland probably had both, because Ireland, I think, has the largest megalithic dolmens and structures in Europe, at least as far as like the size of the stones used. I think they're larger than like any place else in the world, or at least in Europe. So a lot of this is just kind of pan-British, British Isles history. But, eventually either the corded ware or either the Beaker people were the Bronze Age Celts, or it was later people that were the Bronze Age Celts, and were seemingly descended from the Yamnaya, because the Paleolithic people, the Ice Age people of Europe, including England, their DNA suggests that they might have had dark skin, or at least relatively dark skin. We're not exactly sure what tone or whatever, but and some of them may have had light skin as well, because it seems that light skin started developing within the Neolithic, possibly as a result of the changes in eating habits and lifestyle habits. Maybe the introduction of dairy or something triggered. This is one of the main theories, at least, that it triggered a mutation that led to the first instance of a wide scale sort of white people, you could say, during the Neolithic. But I think even during the Neolithic, that was far from universal. That was just a segment of the population. So like I think that there's a fossil called Cheddar Man, who's from Cheddar, probably where cheddar cheese is from, that I think is near where Stonehenge is, and it was thought to have maybe been from, I suppose, the Long Barrow, either the Long Barrow people who built Stonehenge or from the previous inhabitants of England who might have interbred with them, and he's basically thought to have had a dark complexion. Whereas the Yamnaya people who came, the Bronze Age people who came to Britain, they probably, at least a lot more of them probably were light complexioned. And that may also have been a result of another branch of kind of Neolithic triggered mutations based on, lifestyle changes from agriculture and animal husbandry, or some type of mutation that came out of that time, either a product of the culture and the technological changes, or a product of some kind of natural environmental influences. Although there's also, I think, the chance, and some have also theorized that that some of the kind of lighter skinned morphology was passed down from some of the Cro-Magnons during the Ice Age, as it does seem like there were at least one or two of the many Cro-Magnon fossils, the Ice Age hybrids, at least one or two which seem to have some genes suggesting a light complexion, unless I'm just thinking of the light colored eyes. And certainly the Neanderthals, there are some genes that modern light-skinned people have in their skin, which are Neanderthal genes that have led some to suspect that Neanderthals were light complexioned, and that they passed on somehow these genetics that either somehow skipped like a million generations and then appeared during the Neolithic and Bronze Age, triggered by environmental or cultural technological changes, or had been extant throughout the whole period, but just had been kind of an isolated, relatively unknown population, maybe in the Caucasus refugium, that then later spread out and like took over all the places that were occupied by the dark-skinned people. So it's hard to know exactly the origin. It could be both, but either way, the Yamnaya, the Yamna seem to have, at least a lot of them seem to have had light complexion, and more of them than probably any other population in world history, or at least in the world. So they and they were less Neanderthaloid. I mean, that's an argument for it not being, I suppose, for it not being a trait descended from Neanderthal, is that the lighter skinned Bronze Age Yamnaya from Ukraine, or seemingly from Ukraine, and possibly descended from people from the Caucasus and maybe from Nordic region, or kind of Arctic regions. But they were lighter skinned and less Neanderthaloid. So, you'd think of it, if the light skin was descended from the light skinned Neanderthals, then you would see more Neanderthal DNA and morphology. But there is the chance too that the Bronze Age people did have the same, did have also equally or higher levels of Neanderthal DNA, but it just was expressed differently, or that they didn't have as long of heads because maybe they didn't practice neonatal cranial neanderthalization, the head binding that was used by the Neolithic race to accentuate the Neanderthaloid, cranial morphology. So yeah, it's hard to really know about that. I mean, I guess I would say that the Yamnaya, they were quite tall, and that was part of how they conquered the world, basically. I mean, they were like the Aryans. Nowadays people tend to say Indo-European, but they were those people, and they basically took over Eurasia and took over the world, partly by being very tall, and I think they were descended from Ice Age, basically Cro-Magnon, like megafauna hunters of the steppes, of the Russian steppe, or however you pronounce that. So yeah, I think they were the mammoth hunters. Yeah. So somehow those people had been super tall. Maybe they were basically the people that were at Volny Vestanice or whatever, near Moscow. But they were tall. Oddly enough, they were tall from Neanderthal DNA, even though Neanderthals were short. But the reason this is, I believe, is because Neanderthals were very robust. Their bones were very thick. They were very stocky. So, and sapiens, the ones that came into Eurasia at that time and into Europe, and that area, were relatively gracile and slender, and so I think that when these two interbred, instead of becoming stocky the way Neanderthals were, the kind of slender sapiens morphology just became super tall. So the kind of added mass of the Neanderthal morphology, instead of expanding outward as it would in a pure Neanderthal, expand upward when combined with the kind of slender sapiens physique. So, these, and in a sense, those were the classic Cro-Magnon. I mean, Cro-Magnon were also called Cro-Magnons. They were, they were known for being tall. They were much taller than the Neolithic race, quote unquote, the relatively short people that spread agriculture out from Anatolia and everything. So they had that going for them. They basically were taller than everybody. So that made it easy to conquer the world. Also, they had domesticated horses. So that was a big deal. They were basically the first people, they were either the first people or one of the very first to have domesticated horses. And, they used them to great effect. And there was these basically sedentary, short farmers who were just chilling, all over Europe and the world and whatever. And in come these, maybe 6-7 foot tall guys on horseback, and probably pretty big too, strong, and they had metallurgy, far beyond what was possessed in Europe, because Europe was still in the Neolithic. Like the Bronze Age started in, seemingly in the Middle East or around the Middle East, about 5,000 years ago. But it was still the Neolithic in Europe until maybe 4,000 years ago, when these Yamnaya brought the bronze technology into Europe. So the Europeans were screwed. They're like short. They had learned agriculture, or maybe they were from Anatolia and they brought agriculture, but like that was, they were farmers, and they had their religions and everything, and but they didn't have really metallurgy. They had like gold, which is, I don't know if they had actual I don't know that they actually melted down gold, but they knew how to, like, I guess, bang it into shape or whatever, like the really primitive Neolithic methods of working with gold. I think they had that, and they might have had silver, but they didn't have bronze. And so, these guys come out of left field with, like, on top of horses, and they're maybe 7 feet tall, and they're wielding bronze swords, axes, and spears and arrows and all that. And they meant business, apparently, because they took over all of Europe. Because their languages, Indo-European languages, are throughout Europe, and it's generally thought that that wasn't the case up until that time. That basically there were no Aryan speakers in Europe until the Bronze Age, presumably, or at least that's a high likelihood that there were people. Or like the Finno-Ugaritic languages, and there was like the Basque language, and there were probably other languages related to Basque in Europe. Like the Basques and the Finno-Ugaritic people that's all that's left of the native Europeans, but at least linguistically. So these Yamnaya people came from Ukraine into Europe, and I mean, I don't know, I don't think we can necessarily call Ukraine. Ukraine is like between Europe and Asia, I guess. So I don't know, it's Ukraine. But they came into Europe, conquered Europe, and wiped out almost everybody, especially in Scandinavia. Because the Scandinavian people were dark skinned, dark complexioned people, short Neolithic people, and but the tall, blonde hair, blue eyed, horse riding white Aryans came in from Ukraine, and they replaced almost entirely the Scandinavian population. So Scandinavians are especially kind of, they are kind of like pure Aryans in that sense. Like they're almost fully descended from those kind of that kind of marauding nation. And but in Britain they took over, and so it's a question. I'm not sure what the consensus is on this. I think it's probably unresolved, but they may have been Celts, like those Yamnaya, at least the ones that went into Europe. They may have basically been the Celts, and so they took over, because most of Europe was Celtic until the Romans. The Romans defeated the Celts, but then basically the Germanic people did a kind of almost like a second Yamnaya wave against the Celts, and the Celts were, a lot of them, kind of hybrids of earlier Yamnaya who had interbred with the native European Neolithic people and created probably some kind of a hybrid culture. But then the kind of more pure Aryans came in again, like 1,000 years ago, or I guess about 1,000 years ago, and basically took over everything. I mean, they took over Germany from the Celts, and they took over Austria, and they took over France, and I think they took over Spain too. It was like the Ostrogoths took over Spain. So they were like, basically one of these Scandinavian groups. And then the Anglo-Saxons took over. The Anglo-Saxons and the Normans took over Britain and the British Isles. So these were all Germanic people, like a later kind of wave of more genetically more pure sapiens. Pure Aryans that came in, and I'm not sure of their composition of sapiens versus Neanderthal DNA, if there was any difference between the Celts and the Germanic people in that sense. But I think the Celtic populations often inherited different aspects, different chunks of the Neanderthal genome. They maybe didn't get as much of the height as the Yamnaya had, and the Scandinavians, whatever, Germanic people had, but they had a lot of the other features. And of course, the height, like I said, is not an actual Neanderthal trait, but was a product of Neanderthal genetic admixture, hybridization. So let's see how much time I got left. I don't know. Don't really understand this, but I'm going to try to get into somewhat recognizable times. Scotland. So the Anglo-Saxons came in. So I'll back up to the first kind of history we have of Scotland is history of the Picts. They're called the Picts. They're also called the Caledonians. Although I think technically the Caledoni may have just been one branch, one group of them, one nation or tribe. I'm not sure about that, but basically the first history we have of them, you could say, like written history, is from the Romans, who took over England and tried to take over Scotland, but they didn't have an easy time of it because the Scots were not having it, or the the people that lived there, who they called the Picts, the Picti, or the Caledoni. Some say that they were called the Picti because they painted pictures on their skin, basically like tattoos, using blue woad dye, I think. And I think they would go into battle